Ukrainian units have forced the Russians to slow their advance in the area of Hryshyn and Rodinsky. There are still ongoing firefights there. The defense forces are operating with active support from UAV and artillery units. The enemy is unsuccessfully sending in additional groups to attack this sector. All Russian assault troops are being destroyed. The Pokrovsk bridgehead remains the main one for the Russians. According to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, here and also in the Kostiantynivka direction, the defense forces have stopped the most attempts by the Russian occupation army to break through Ukrainian positions since the start of the day. The soldiers note that the enemy is using a large number of aerial bombs here and deploying UAVs of all possible types, from heavy hexacopters to light reconnaissance drones.
At this very moment, their primary objective is to push forward and get into Kostiantynivka. They are determined to take full control of Kostiantynivka and the neighboring town of Drushkiv as well. That's why there's such fierce fighting here.
For almost a year, units of the Corps have been successfully repelling the enemy's attempts to capture Kostiantynivka, holding their positions and inflicting significant losses on the enemy. The command staff demonstrates a high level of adaptability to changes on the battlefield, making proactive and unconventional decisions. The top priorities remain striking the rear logistics of the Russian occupiers and neutralizing enemy infantry at the onset of their assaults. Alexander Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Facebook. The Huliaipol direction also remains one of the hottest spots. Military experts note that the invaders are not giving up their attempts to advance in this sector. However, the nature of their actions now is somewhat different from the plan the Russian army tried to implement during the fall-winter period.
Only on the southern flank of our entire defensive line, stretching from Huliaipol toward the west, the enemy forces are persistently trying to continue their offensive actions toward the critical railway flank of our Orikhiv defensive stronghold. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Defense Forces are actively counterattacking the enemy positions to the north. So the overall plan to advance along the Donetsk-Zaporizhia highway and across a wide front to the south up to our defensive line is being thwarted by the Russians.
Ukrainian soldiers continue to actively destroy Russian equipment. The National Guard troops from Kortych reported the destruction of the occupiers' Panzer aircraft missile and gun system, worth $15 million. Military experts note that the Ukrainian armed forces are taking out Russian army equipment every single day.
The disruption of vehicle logistics leads to what? It means that evacuating from the battlefield is at the very least much more difficult. Delivering various resources to the front line has also become more difficult because you can't get much done with donkeys, carts, or even horses. Accordingly, this means the number of KIAs is also increasing. Those are the irrecoverable losses that the Russian army has started to suffer. There are more Kias now because they can't handle the logistics.
Just in the past day, along the entire front line, Ukrainian soldiers destroyed 4 Russian armored fighting vehicles, 65 artillery systems, 3 MLRSs, and disabled more than 200 vehicles and fuel trucks. They also took down nearly 2,000 Russian drones.
Go ahead. Got it. We could have some coffee, too.
Also, yesterday, the Defense Forces eliminated 980 Russian occupiers. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the total losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion have already exceeded 1,305,000 soldiers.
So we'll be discussing the situation at the front with our guest. Mykola Malomuzh, General of the Ukrainian Army, head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine from 2005 to 2010. He is joining us live now. Hello, Nikolai Grigorievich.
Glory to Ukraine. Greetings. Glory to Ukraine.
How do you assess the capabilities of the Russian Federation, considering the latest news that they now have certain deadlines? How much strength do they really have left, both in manpower and equipment? And where, in your opinion, will they focus their attention the most?
Well, I remember that Putin set the goal to completely capture the Donetsk region within 2 months, and that's why they're focusing their main efforts there. They don't have the resources to conduct strategic operations in 8 directions, as he currently claims. So they'll concentrate their strikes on Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk. As for Myrnograd, that'll be the southern approach toward Krematorsk. And of course, they'll try to advance offensive operations from Lyman and Slavyansk, with the goal of closing off the strategic space of our defense from both sides and moving to a siege. But that approach isn't working out for them. We can see that in just a day, the activity on the Kostiantynivka axis has become the main focus of their attack. Of course, it ended in failure. We've already conducted deep reconnaissance several times and saw that the enemy is trying to bring in reinforcements here, new reserves. It's a very sound position, and now it's been voiced by Commander Sersky as well. Preemptive strikes on their rear. Striking at their reserves, logistics, and firepower, especially drone launchers, renders them ineffective. Systematic strikes, both with fire and with the movement of small assault groups, which they use. Right now, they're using a combined approach to the situation. These small assault groups are moving around, of course, on ATVs, buggies, and vans, and they're trying to bring in repurposed armored vehicles. But we've already encountered all these scenarios in our combat experience, so we're able to neutralize them. Yes, over there. There are heavy battles in the Kostiantynivka direction, but we're holding our ground, fighting back, and destroying the main part of the enemy and their equipment. This sector is actually crucial for neutralizing the enemy's new units and concentrating resources from the rest of the troops. And again, according to information from the General Staff, in the past day, we've eliminated and rendered combat ineffective over 1,000 people. Previously, it was 1,200 or more. These are heavy losses, even though the number of attacks has decreased. This already shows that, as our commanders note, every square meter will have to be taken with blood. But now it costs them twice as much as it did, say, 2 or 3 months ago. In other words, we're defending more effectively, depleting their reserves more efficiently, and the enemy doesn't have enough additional resources to advance further. But the fighting is still intense because Putin has set this objective. And of course, the Pokrovsk and Mirograd sectors are very challenging areas for defensive operations, but the enemy can't advance there either. Any advances there are limited to, let's say, combat distances, 10 to 100 meters, sometimes up to 300, but there haven't been any major breakthroughs, especially since we're counterattacking. This is another model that allows us to undermine the enemy, especially in their weak spots, where they don't expect it, or with flanking attacks or night strikes. It's a very effective model, and now special operations are underway. This involves working against the enemy's rear and flanks. This kind of unconventional action, which throws the enemy off balance, not only helps us defend our positions, but also, of course, spreads panic and preempts possible new Sardinian attacks. Of course, we're not leaving the field open, so right now we've reinforced our positions there. Not only that, we've already established a line of fortified areas in certain sectors, and we're also using the same tactic of destroying the reserves they're gradually bringing in. And yes, the number of attacks has gone down, though there are still a lot, usually over 20, but there's almost no more enemy advancement, and we're pretty much stabilizing the situation there. And as for the other directions, we see that these are more tactical in nature. We even see Lyman, which seemed especially important at first. Now, so to speak, it's in a phase of tactical enemy advances, but without any real success. It's the same with the Kharkiv direction near Kupiansk. They've already abandoned the idea of capturing it completely and declaring to all of Russia that Kupiansk is theirs. Everyone has clearly admitted by now that it was a lie. They claim to have captured it 3 times, and now any attempts to get closer in any way, we're firmly repelling them. And there are also alternative actions. Of course, that's the Sumy direction. It was more or less quiet there, but there's been increased activity over the past day, 6 attacks. But we're already prepared to repel them, and those advances that happened in some villages, we pushed them back and liberated the territory. So in this situation now, these attacks are basically meant to pull our troops away, as they think we should have to use additional reserves because they're showing increased activity in their attacks there. Overall, the front is holding firm. Yes, the fighting is tough, and the enemy is preparing new reserves. If we look at it strategically, they're also preparing new systematic jet-type drones. But our advantage, as we've already noted, is that we already have. In terms of drone systems of all types, we have about a 20 to 25% advantage. And in some of the hardest hit areas, it's even higher, where we're already reaching targets over 1,000 and even 1,200 kilometers away, like oil refineries and launch platforms. That's now our priority. I think we'll continue to scale up production, especially of drones. Such missiles are reducing Russia's capabilities, both deep inside the country and in the occupied territories, as well as their potential. The supply of oil and petroleum products abroad, which is now stopped, is essential for the Russian economy. The deficit is enormous. So this approach of neutralizing 40% of their exports is a very powerful blow to Russia's finances, especially its defense sector.
Let's talk about certain plans that the enemy has in one way or another, but which also exist on the Ukrainian side. So the Russians have ambitious plans for 2026 and the years beyond, but the enemy does not have the resources to carry out these plans. This was stated in an interview with RBC Ukraine by the deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Brigadier General Pavlopoulos. According to him, Russia continues to dream about the so-called buffer zone. Let's listen and then continue our conversation.
The Russians are constantly changing their plans. First and foremost, the deadlines for carrying them out. Of course, their main focus this year will be on the Donbas, and if conditions are favorable for them, they will also expand and intensify their efforts in the southern direction. That includes the Alexandrovsk and all Zaporizhia directions. As for their further intentions, the Russians still have plans to create a buffer zone in the Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv regions, and to create conditions for an attempt to seize Zaporizhia and Kherson, and in the long term to realize their aggressive ambitions to seize the Mykolaiv and Odessa regions. Pavlo Polisa, deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Brigadier General, in an interview with RBC Ukraine news agency.
Nikolai Grigorovich, if we talk about possible scenarios for how events might unfold based on the plans the enemy currently has, what would you say those scenarios are? Well, let's put it this way. In the near future, the immediate, for the next 3 months, for example?
Well, Pablo didn't say anything new. This has been said dozens of times already. The enemy's plans have been voiced, and for the coming months, so to speak, including specific regions, buffer zones, and possibly, as they say, the capture of Odessa and Mykolaiv. So all of this is, just the fantasies of the Russian Federation. They've stated them repeatedly. Putin voiced them at the meeting of the Defense Ministry Board, all these points. Legally, not even intelligent. Ours gathers information, of course. He's saying that this is what he's gonna do. But honestly, I'll say this is more about information warfare. In other words, he's trying to intimidate. He has plans. So surrender, give up the territory of Donbas, and I'll stop all aggressive operations to seize Odessa, Mykolaiv, and we'll keep moving forward. That's why it doesn't work. Right now, we see that Putin has no cards to play. They use Trump's words. In other words, there are no reserves, no potential, and no systemic motivation. And he understands this himself. So yes, he talks about these plans. Yes, he's supposedly preparing reserves to capture Donetsk region, which, I'll say directly, have already been deployed dozens of times. We've repeatedly noted that regarding Pokrovsk, there have been 23 deadlines since September 2025 when he announced he would capture Pokrovsk. Now that's been neutralized. I'm not even talking about Donbas anymore, let alone 5 regions of Ukraine. In other words, it's just unrealistic. Putin doesn't have any reserves. Launching a full-scale mobilization would be very risky for him. There's growing discontent in Russian society over the heavy losses. And over a war with no prospects. That's the most important thing. Even people in Russia's remote regions can see that the losses are mounting. In their villages and towns, there just aren't any people left, especially men. And there's no result, nothing he promised. That's a stab in the back for him. That's why he won't risk a large-scale mobilization. Yes, he'll try to bring in more people, use different methods, but now we're talking about forces and resources. That's about what he can muster. Through mobilization, then signing contracts, recruiting young guys, as we say, or other ways of enlisting people, it's around 400,000 or so. The balance is negative. In about a year, we eliminate over 400,000 of them. That's why Russia can't build up reserves for large-scale offensives or to carry out these plans right now. Yes, they'll still try to carry out operations, especially along the front line and in Donbas, and to create certain buffer zones, but there's no real prospect of them succeeding. That's why, in this situation, they're looking for some kind of peace options. This is already our operational intel about how they're trying to get out of this war, but on their own terms. That's why there's pressure through the Americans, other channels, and strikes on civilians, especially now without any cover. Not just on energy infrastructure, but on people. This is already changing the tactics of their attacks. This includes attacks on buses, on the railways, and just on civilian targets in general. This is already the tactic of a top-level terrorist. Terror
Remains. Thank you very much, Nikolai Grigoryevic.